The December wind howled through the pines surrounding the Hartley's timber frame cabin, carrying with it the promise of another brutal Montana winter. Situated on the eastern slope of the Bitterroot Mountains, their homestead stood as a defiant speck against the vast wilderness that stretched for miles in every direction. The nearest town, Clearwater Junction, was a 40-minute drive on good days, nearly impossible to reach when heavy snow buried the unmarked road that Jack had carved out himself 5 years ago. Jack Hartley, a former forest ranger with deep-set blue eyes and weathered skin that spoke of years under the Montana sun, stood at the cabin's front window. His broad shoulders remained tense as he surveyed the gathering storm clouds above the tree-line. Barometers dropping fast, he called over his shoulder to Sarah, who was stoking the wood stove. "I'm guessing we'll have 2 feet by morning." Sarah straightened, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. Unlike her husband, whose Montana roots went back generations, she had grown up in Seattle, trading city convenience for this life of self-reliance. Her hands, once smooth and manicured, now bore the calluses of someone who chopped wood, preserved food, and tended to their small livestock through even the harshest conditions. "The generator's fueled up," she replied, dusting her hands on worn jeans. "And I've filled all the kerosene lamps. We should be fine for at least a week if the power goes." In the corner of their open-concept living area, 3-year-old Ethan sat, surrounded by wooden toys that Jack had carved during the long winter evenings. The boy had inherited his father's resilience and his mother's curiosity, a combination that often led to heart-stopping moments of fearlessness that both terrified and amazed his parents. "Mama, when will the snow get big?" Ethan asked, his small fingers tracing the grain of a wooden wolf figurine, his favorite. Sarah crossed to him, ruffling his sandy brown hair. "Soon, little man. By morning, everything will be white." Jack moved to the stone fireplace, adding another log to the crackling flames. "Remember how I was worried about choosing this life for us?" he asked quietly, his eyes meeting Sarah's. "Especially with Ethan?" Sarah nodded, remembering their heated debates before leaving Seattle 3 years ago, shortly after Ethan was born. Jack had inherited this land from his grandfather, and the pull of returning to a simpler, more self-sufficient life had been too strong to ignore. "I remember," she said, crossing to him and placing a hand on his arm. "And I remember telling you that some kids grow up with silver spoons, but ours would grow up with stars overhead and wilderness in his blood." "Still think it was worth it?" Jack asked, the uncertainty rarely showing in his voice. Before Sarah could answer, the wind rose to a shriek, rattling the double-paned windows. Ethan clapped his hands in delight at nature's display, while their border collie, Buck, raised his head and growled softly. "Every damn day," Sarah replied firmly, squeezing Jack's hand. "Even when the thermometer hits 20 below and the pipes freeze. This is home now." As darkness fell, the first heavy flakes began to descend, visible in the glow of the solar-powered exterior lights. Inside, warmed by the wood stove and fireplace, the Hartleys prepared for another night of isolation in their chosen paradise, unaware that the coming storm would bring more than just snow to their doorstep. The blizzard reached its full fury shortly after midnight. Wind-driven snow pounded against the cabin's sturdy walls like nature's own artillery, while inside, the family slept soundly under thick quilts and woolen blankets. All except Sarah, who found herself wide awake at 2 in the morning, listening to the storm's relentless assault. A lifetime in the city had conditioned her to distrust absolute silence. Now, paradoxically, it was the storm's overwhelming noise that kept her alert. Every moan of wind through the pines registered in her consciousness. This heightened awareness was what allowed her to detect a subtle shift in the night's symphony, a new sound beneath the wind's howl. Sarah slipped from beneath the covers, careful not to wake Jack, whose deep breathing remained steady beside her. She pulled on thick wool socks and wrapped herself in the oversized cardigan she kept draped over a nearby chair. The cabin's main room was still relatively warm, the banked fire in the wood stove maintaining a gentle heat. She moved to the frost-edged window, using the sleeve of her cardigan to clear a small viewing space in the condensation. Outside, the snow swirled in hypnotic patterns, illuminated by the battery-powered security light Jack had installed at the forest's edge. At first, she saw nothing but the dance of snowflakes. Then, a shadow moved against the white backdrop. "Jack?" she whispered urgently, not taking her eyes from the window. When he didn't stir, she called again, louder. "Jack, come here." He was beside her in moments, instantly alert, a skill honed during years of wilderness survival. "What is it?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "Look," Sarah pointed, her breath fogging the glass anew. At the edge of their clearing, partially sheltered by a stand of pines, stood a large female wolf. Her gray-silver coat was dusted with snow, and her amber eyes reflected the security light with an eerie luminescence. Behind her, barely visible, huddled a smaller form, a wolf pup, limping and pressing close to its mother's flank. "Gray wolf," Jack murmured, "likely from the High Valley pack. They don't usually come this close to human dwellings." Sarah studied the mother wolf, noting how she held one paw slightly off the ground, favoring it. "She's injured too, not just the pup. Probably caught in one of those illegal traps the fish and wildlife guys have been finding," Jack said, his voice hardening. "Some outfitters still think the reintroduction program is bad for hunting tourism." The wolf suddenly lifted her head, staring directly at the window, as if she could see them through the glass and darkness. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter night. "She's looking right at us," she whispered. A small voice startled them both. "The wolf wants to come in." They turned to find Ethan standing behind them in his dinosaur pajamas, his hair tousled from sleep, clutching his wooden wolf figure. "Buddy, you should be in bed," Jack said gently, moving to lift his son. But Ethan slipped past him and pressed his small palms against the cold window, his breath creating tiny clouds on the glass. The wolf outside tilted her head, those intelligent eyes now fixed on the child. "She's asking for help," Ethan insisted with the absolute certainty only a 3-year-old could muster. "Her baby is hurt." Sarah knelt beside her son. "Wolves are wild animals, sweetie. They don't ask people for help." "This one is," Ethan replied simply. Outside, as if responding to the child's assessment, the wolf took a halting step closer to the cabin, then stopped. Snow continued to accumulate on her fur, and Sarah could now see that the pup was shivering violently. "We can't just leave them out there," Sarah said, turning to Jack. "Not in this storm." Jack ran a hand through his hair, conflicted. "They're apex predators, Sarah, not stray dogs." "And that's a mother trying to protect her young," Sarah countered, her eyes meeting his in silent communication. "Just like us." In the heavy silence that followed, the wolf let out a soft, almost plaintive whine that carried through the howling wind, a sound so filled with desperation that it seemed to bridge the ancient divide between human and wild. The morning light filtered through the frost-covered windows, casting prism-like patterns across the cabin's wooden floor. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of steaming coffee, while keeping a watchful eye on Ethan. The boy knelt on a chair he had pushed against the window, his small nose practically pressed to the glass as he stared intently at the tool shed where the wolves had taken refuge. Jack entered from outside, stamping snow from his boots before removing them at the door. His cheeks were ruddy from the cold, his breath visible even inside the cabin until the warmth enveloped him. "They're still in there," he reported, hanging his heavy coat on the peg by the door. "I left some water and that venison from last week's hunt just inside the door." The mother watched me the whole time, never growled, never showed teeth. "Just watched," Sarah nodded, unsurprised. There had been something in the wolf's eyes last night, an intelligence, a deliberateness, that defied explanation. "How's the pup's leg?" "Hard to tell without getting closer than Mama would allow," Jack replied, pouring himself coffee. "But he's putting some weight on it now. Whatever was wrapped around it seems to have come loose when they settled in." "You were right to help them," Ethan declared without turning from his window vigil. Jack exchanged a glance with Sarah, who shrugged slightly. Since allowing the wolves into the shed last night, Ethan had displayed an uncanny certainty about the animals' needs and intentions, as if he somehow understood them. "Come eat your breakfast, buddy," Sarah called. "The wolves need to rest." "They're not sleeping," Ethan replied matter-of-factly. "They're waiting." Jack sat beside his son, his weathered hand gentle on the boy's shoulder. "Waiting for what, Ethan?" The child turned to his father, his expression serious, eyes wide with an innocence that nonetheless held surprising depth. "For us to understand." Sarah felt a shiver trace her spine that had nothing to do with the sub-zero temperatures outside. There had always been something old about Ethan's soul, something that seemed to connect with the natural world in ways neither she nor Jack fully comprehended. "What do we need to understand, sweetie?" she asked, joining them at the window. Instead of answering, Ethan pressed his palm flat against the cold glass. Outside, as if sensing the gesture, the mother wolf emerged from the shed doorway into the brilliant morning sunlight. Snow had stopped falling, but drifts reached halfway up the shed walls, creating a pristine white landscape that sparkled like diamond dust. The wolf stood perfectly still, her gray-silver coat stark against the snow, her amber eyes fixed on the cabin window. Behind her, the pup hobbled into view, its leg clearly improved but still tender. "She knows you," Ethan said simply, glancing up at Sarah. "She knows you helped." Jack frowned, the rational part of his forest ranger training battling with what he was witnessing. "Wolves don't think that way, buddy. They're instinctual." "They don't." His words died as the wolf took 3 deliberate steps forward, then lowered her head in what appeared, impossibly, to be a gesture of acknowledgement. "I told you," Ethan whispered, excitement making his voice tremble. "She's different." Sarah knelt to her son's level. "How do you know all this, Ethan? How can you tell what she's thinking?" The boy considered the question with surprising seriousness before answering. "Her eyes talk, like yours do when you don't say words." Jack cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. "Let's not read too much into natural animal behavior, okay? Wolves are fascinating creatures, but they're still wild animals." "Not to Ethan," Sarah said softly, watching as her son once again pressed his hands against the window. Outside, the wolf mirrored the gesture, raising one paw and placing it against the snow-covered ground, her gaze never leaving the boy. "Look," Ethan exclaimed, pointing excitedly. "She's saying hello." The pup had also moved forward now, playfully nipping at its mother's tail. For a moment, brief but undeniable, the scene resembled nothing so much as a family greeting another across a divide, both physical and primordial. "I'm going out to see them," Ethan declared suddenly, sliding from his chair. "Absolutely not," Jack said firmly, catching his son's arm. "We observe from a distance. That's the rule with wild animals. Always." Ethan's face fell, disappointment evident in every feature. "But Dad, she wants to meet me. Really meet me." The conviction in his voice gave even Jack pause. Sarah touched her husband's shoulder gently. "Maybe we could all go out, together, just to the porch. We stay behind the railing, and the wolves stay in the yard. No direct contact." Jack hesitated, years of wildlife training warring with the inexplicable tableau unfolding outside their window. Finally, he nodded. "Bundled up, on the porch, behind me and your mother at all times. Promise." Ethan's face lit up. "Promise. Can we go now? Please." 10 minutes later, wrapped in layers of wool and down, the family stood on their covered porch. The temperature had risen slightly with the sun, but their breath still clouded in the mountain air. The wolves remained where they had been, the mother alert and watching, the pup more cautious now in the presence of 3 humans. "Hey there," Sarah called softly, surprised at her own instinct to speak to the wild creature as she might to a person. The wolf's ears flicked forward at the sound of her voice. "She understands," Ethan whispered with absolute certainty. "She's saying thank you for the safe place." The standoff continued for several long minutes, the family on their sheltered porch, the wolves in the snow-covered yard. A tense tableau connected by nothing more than shared gazes and the thin thread of understanding that seemed to run between Ethan and the mother wolf. Jack shifted uncomfortably, his hand instinctively resting on Ethan's shoulder. "This isn't normal behavior," he muttered. "Wild wolves avoid human contact at all costs, especially with pups present." "Maybe she's desperate," Sarah suggested, her voice low. "The pup's injury, the storm, she might have had no choice." The wolf took a tentative step closer, causing Jack to tense further. The animal stopped immediately, as if sensing his discomfort. "She won't hurt us, Dad," Ethan said with that unwavering certainty. "She just needs help with her baby." Sarah studied the injured pup more carefully. Even from this distance, she could see what appeared to be remnants of wire or thin metal wrapped around its back leg, likely a snare that hadn't closed completely but had become entangled nonetheless. "Jack," she whispered, "look at the pup's leg. That's not a natural injury." Jack followed her gaze, his forester's trained eye picking up what she had noticed. His expression hardened. "Illegal trapping. Has to be." There's no authorized trapping of any kind in this area, especially not for wolves. The mother wolf seemed to understand they were discussing her offspring. She nudged the pup gently, pushing it forward slightly as if offering evidence of what had happened. I need to help them, Sarah said suddenly, her decision crystallizing in that moment. Jack turned to her, incredulous. Help them how? We're not wildlife veterinarians, Sarah. I was a vet tech before Ethan was born, she reminded him. 3 years at the Seattle Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. I've treated worse than this. On sedated animals in controlled environments, Jack countered. Not wild wolves in our front yard. Sarah met his gaze steadily. If we do nothing, that pup might lose the leg, or worse. And we both know what kind of message that sends to our son about responsibility and compassion. Jack's jaw worked silently, his internal conflict visible on his weathered face. Finally, he sighed. What's your plan? The first aid kit in your truck has wire cutters and antiseptic, Sarah said, her mind already working through the procedure. If I can get close enough. No, Jack interrupted firmly. I'll do it. You stay here with Ethan. She trusts me, Sarah argued. I'm the one who opened the shed last night. And I'm the one with 15 years of wildlife management experience, Jack countered. This isn't up for debate, Sarah. Their quiet argument was interrupted by Ethan's small voice. She wants to come to the shed again, to show us the hurt better. Both parents looked down at their son, then followed his gaze back to the wolves. The mother had indeed turned toward the tool shed, taking a few steps before looking back at them expectantly. See, Ethan said triumphantly. Sarah and Jack exchanged glances. I'll get the first aid kit, Jack conceded. But we approach this carefully. One wrong move, and I know, Sarah nodded. I'll get some of the venison from the freezer. Having food might help keep her calm. 20 minutes later, they reconvened at the shed. Jack had insisted Ethan remain on the porch, secured inside a playpen they normally used for outdoor time when both adults needed to work. The boy had protested but ultimately agreed after his mother promised a full report. The wolf and her pup had returned to the shed, seeming to understand that help was coming. Sarah pushed the door wider, allowing sunlight to flood the small space. The interior smelled of metal, oil, and earthy potting soil from Sarah's dormant gardening supplies. The mother wolf stood protectively over her pup in the far corner, amber eyes watchful but not hostile. Hey, girl, Sarah said softly, her voice deliberately calm and even. We're going to help your little one, okay? Jack remained skeptical but followed his wife's lead, moving slowly and deliberately. He placed the first aid kit on a workbench and withdrew the wire cutters and antiseptic. The venison, he whispered. Sarah withdrew a package of frozen meat from her coat pocket. Already thawing. She unwrapped it partway and placed it on the ground, sliding it toward the wolves with her foot. The mother wolf sniffed the air but made no move toward the offering. Instead, she nudged her pup forward, a gesture so deliberate it took Sarah's breath away. Jack, she whispered. She wants us to help. That's impossible, he insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. Look at her, Sarah countered. Really look. The wolf met Sarah's gaze directly, then lowered her head slightly, stepping back to create space between herself and her injured offspring. The message couldn't have been clearer if she'd spoken aloud. Help my child. Jack exhaled slowly. I've never seen anything like this in all my years as a ranger. Sarah approached carefully, kneeling a few feet from the pup. Let's not waste this trust, she said quietly, extending her hand palm down in a non-threatening gesture. You're going to feel better soon, little one. The mother wolf watched every move, alert but allowing their approach. As Sarah gently examined the entangled wire on the pup's leg, she felt Jack's presence behind her, solid and protective. But she also sensed something else, a shift in his understanding, a widening of possibilities. Some bonds, Sarah realized as she carefully began to free the injured pup, transcended the expected boundaries between wild and tame, between human and animal, forming connections as ancient and mysterious as the Montana wilderness itself. The day following their unexpected veterinary intervention dawned clear and cold, the storm having moved eastward overnight, leaving behind a landscape transformed into crystalline white perfection. Jack rose before sunrise, as was his habit, moving quietly through the cabin to avoid waking Sarah and Ethan. He stoked the banked fire in the wood stove, adding seasoned pine logs that caught quickly, filling the room with the comforting scent of wood smoke and resin. After pulling on his insulated work clothes and heavy boots, he stepped onto the porch to assess the day. The thermometer mounted beside the door registered 15 degrees below zero, brutal but not unusual for a Montana January. His breath formed thick clouds in the frigid air as he surveyed their property, gaze inevitably drawn to the tool shed where the wolves had spent the night. The shed door stood slightly ajar, just as they had left it. Jack approached cautiously, alert for any movement, but found the small structure empty. In the fresh snow, he could clearly see where the wolves had departed, the mother's distinct paw prints alongside the smaller, slightly irregular tracks of the pup, heading north toward the dense forest that bordered their property. "Good," he murmured to himself. "Back where you belong." As he turned to begin his morning chores, a sound carried through the clear mountain air, the sharp, unmistakable crack of a high-powered rifle. Jack froze, listening intently. Hunting season had ended weeks ago. There was no legitimate reason for anyone to be firing rifles in this area, especially not at dawn. A second shot echoed, then a third in rapid succession. Jack's jaw tightened. The direction placed the shooting approximately 2 miles north, precisely the direction the wolves had headed. He strode purposefully back to the cabin, entering quietly but with urgency. Sarah was already awake, preparing breakfast at the small propane stove. "Someone's hunting," he said without preamble, reaching for his own rifle mounted on the wall rack. Sarah turned, spatula in hand. "Hunting? Now." 3 shots, from the north ridge. Jack checked the weapon methodically, his movements precise. "Exactly where our visitors headed." Sarah's expression hardened with understanding. "Poachers? Has to be." Jack pulled on his heavy winter parka. "I'm going to investigate. If it's just someone taking an out-of-season deer, I'll report it to Fish and Wildlife. But if they're after wolves..." The implication hung in the air between them. Protected though they might be, gray wolves remained controversial in Montana, with some ranchers and hunters viewing them as threats to livestock and game animals rather than vital parts of the ecosystem. "Be careful," Sarah said, her voice tight with concern. "Don't confront them directly." Jack nodded grimly, pulling his radio from its charger. "I'll stay in contact. Range should be good enough from the ridge." He was halfway out the door when Ethan's small voice stopped him. "Dad, are the people hurting the wolves?" Jack turned to find his son standing in the hallway, tousled from sleep, but eyes alert with worry. "I don't know, buddy," Jack answered honestly. "But I'm going to find out." "Don't let them hurt our wolves," Ethan said with surprising intensity. Jack knelt to his son's level. "They're wild animals, Ethan, not ours. But I'll do what I can to make sure everyone follows the rules about leaving them alone." He ruffled Ethan's hair and departed quickly, following the wolves' tracks northward through the deep snow. The going was difficult, each step sinking him knee-deep despite his snowshoes. After 40 minutes of steady hiking, he approached the ridge cautiously, keeping to the tree line for cover. The sound of engines made him drop to a crouch. Through the sparse trees, he spotted 3 pickup trucks parked haphazardly in a small clearing. Their Montana plates were partially obscured by mud. Deliberately, Jack suspected. 3 men stood in a loose circle, rifles casually held across their bodies. A 4th knelt in the snow, examining something Jack couldn't yet see. Moving silently from tree to tree, Jack closed the distance until their voices became audible. "Got the female," one was saying, a tall man in an expensive-looking hunting jacket. "Clean shot, but the pup got away." "Tagged at least 1 more from the main pack," replied another, pulling a can of chewing tobacco from his pocket. "Can't confirm the kill, though." "Montana Fish and Wildlife can kiss my ass," said the kneeling man, rising to reveal what he'd been examining. The still form of a gray wolf, its silver coat stark against the bloody snow. "These vermin are destroying elk populations. State won't handle it, so we will." Jack felt cold fury building in his chest. The dead wolf was unmistakably the mother who had sought their help, the distinctive markings around her muzzle removing any doubt. He reached for his radio, prepared to call in the coordinates to the nearest ranger station, when branches snapped behind him. Jack turned too late as a 5th hunter emerged from the trees. "Well, what do we have here?" the newcomer called out, his rifle trained on Jack's chest. "Looks like we got ourselves an eavesdropper, boys." The others turned, weapons raised. Jack straightened slowly, raising his empty hands. "Jack Hartley." He introduced himself calmly, though his heart hammered in his chest. Former Montana Fish and Wildlife. This is protected land, gentlemen, and wolf hunting is illegal in this sector. The apparent leader snorted. You're that off-grid family from the valley, aren't you? Living in that fancy timber cabin like some kind of mountain hippies. How I live isn't relevant, Jack replied evenly. What is relevant is that I've got your faces, your vehicle descriptions, and enough evidence of poaching to put you away for a good long while. That right? The leader stepped closer, his weathered face twisted in contempt. And who exactly are you planning to tell? Way out here with no witnesses. The standoff lengthened, tension crackling in the frigid air. Jack's mind raced through options, none of them good. These men had already demonstrated their willingness to break the law, and people who would illegally kill protected wildlife might not hesitate to eliminate human obstacles as well. The tense confrontation on the ridge ended in an uneasy stalemate. The hunters, unwilling to escalate to violence against a former wildlife officer, had reluctantly departed with veiled threats and the ominous promise that this isn't over. Jack had documented everything. Their faces, license plates, the illegal kill, with the camera on his phone before hiking back to the cabin, the weight of the mother wolf's death heavy on his shoulders. Now, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the snow-covered yard, Jack stood at the kitchen window, watching Sarah comfort a devastated Ethan. The news of the wolf's death had hit the boy with surprising force, as if he'd lost a longtime companion rather than a wild animal he'd encountered only briefly. I need to check the perimeter, Jack announced, needing both action and solitude to process his anger. Make sure those bastards aren't coming around here. Sarah looked up from where she knelt beside Ethan. Be careful, she cautioned, her eyes communicating volumes about her concern for his safety. Outside, the temperature had risen slightly, creating a strange, hushed quality in the air as the top layer of snow began to soften. Jack walked the boundary of their property methodically, scanning for any sign of intruders. As he approached the tool shed, something caught his eye: unusual markings in the snow near the structure's entrance. At first glance, they appeared to be typical animal tracks, perhaps from the wolf pup returning to the last place it had seen its mother. But as Jack drew closer, the hairs on the back of his neck rose. These weren't normal tracks at all. The paw prints seemed deliberately placed, forming patterns that no animal would naturally create. What the hell? He muttered, crouching to examine them more closely. The prints formed what looked almost like concentric circles, with strange lines radiating outward in specific directions. In his 15 years working with wildlife, Jack had never seen anything remotely like it. He pulled out his phone and took several photos from different angles, his rational mind searching for explanations. Perhaps the pup had been injured and disoriented, moving in confused patterns. But this didn't look confused. It looked intentional. The sound of crunching snow announced Sarah's approach. Ethan's finally calmed down, she said, her voice still tight with emotion. I've never seen him so. She stopped abruptly, noticing Jack's focused attention on the ground. What is it? Look at this, he said, gesturing to the patterns in the snow. Have you ever seen tracks like these? Sarah knelt beside him, her expression shifting from curiosity to astonishment. Those almost look like symbols, Jack finished. I know it sounds crazy, but they look deliberate. Like some kind of... Sarah hesitated, as if afraid to voice what she was thinking. Communication, Jack supplied, feeling slightly ridiculous even as he said it. As if the pup was trying to leave us a message. They stared at each other for a long moment, the implications hanging between them. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. Remember what Ethan said? About how the mother wolf's eyes were talking? Jack ran a hand through his hair. Sarah, we can't seriously be considering this. Wolves don't communicate with symbols. They're incredible animals, but they're not, what? Sentient in that way. Sarah challenged. Then how do you explain this? She gestured to the patterns. This isn't random, Jack. You know animal behavior better than anyone. Is there any natural explanation for this arrangement of tracks? He wanted to argue, to find some rational explanation that wouldn't upend everything he thought he knew about wildlife. But the evidence was literally imprinted in the snow before them. Let me get my field journal, he said finally. I want to record these exactly. While Jack fetched his notebook, Sarah continued studying the markings, her mind racing. When a sudden realization struck her, she called out to Jack, who was returning from the cabin. Jack, I think it might be a map. A map, he repeated skeptically. Look, Sarah pointed, tracing the pattern without touching it. This circular arrangement here could represent our cabin and clearing. These lines leading out could be pathways. And this larger circle over here, with all these small marks inside, could be a location. Jack finished, his skepticism giving way to dawning wonder. Possibly where the rest of the pack is. Sarah stood, brushing snow from her knees. The pup went back to its pack after the mother was killed. But it came here first, left this. She gestured to the marks. It's trying to lead us to them. Or warn us about the hunters, Jack added, the pieces beginning to align in his mind. If they killed the mother and wounded others, the pack could be in danger. They stood in silence, the Montana wilderness stretching vast and secret around them. The implications were staggering. If what they suspected was true, it would challenge fundamental understandings about wolf intelligence and communication. What do we do? Sarah finally asked. Jack looked from the markings to the forest beyond their property, his ranger instincts warring with his scientific skepticism. If there's even a small chance we're right, and the rest of the pack is wounded and being hunted illegally. He straightened. Decision made. We follow the map. What about Ethan? Sarah asked. We'll take turns, Jack decided. I'll go first, follow these directions as best I can. You stay with Ethan. If I'm not back by nightfall, I'll radio the ranger station, Sarah finished. Jack nodded, then hesitated. Sarah, I know how this sounds. If I told anyone else about wolf-drawn maps leading humans to their pack, they'd think we've been in isolation too long, she acknowledged with a small smile. Maybe we have, or maybe there are still mysteries in these mountains that science hasn't cataloged yet. As Jack prepared for his tracking expedition, gathering supplies and weapons for protection, Ethan appeared at the door, watching his father with solemn eyes. You're going to find the other wolves, he stated with that uncanny certainty. Jack paused. How did you know that, buddy? Ethan shrugged, the gesture oddly adult on his small frame. The wolf baby told us where to look. In the snow. Jack and Sarah exchanged glances, a silent communication of their own passing between them, a mixture of wonder and disquiet at their son's connection to these events. If you find them, Ethan continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, tell them I'm sorry about their mama. The forest closed around Jack like a living entity, branches heavy with snow creating a canopy that filtered the afternoon sunlight into dappled patterns across the white ground. He followed the directions indicated in the strange snow markings, moving northeast from their property along what appeared to be a game trail. The tracking was easy at first. The snow preserved a clear record of the wolf pup's passage, its distinctive limping gait leaving asymmetrical prints that Jack could distinguish from other wildlife. 2 hours into his trek, Jack paused at a small stream, partially frozen but with water still flowing beneath a shelf of ice. Here the trail became more challenging, the pup having crossed the water, which left a gap in the track. Jack studied the opposite bank carefully, finally spotting where the animal had emerged several yards downstream. Smart move, he muttered appreciatively. It was a classic predator technique, using water to break a scent trail from pursuers. This pup had learned well from its mother. The thought of the slain wolf sent a renewed surge of anger through Jack's body. He'd called his contact at the Montana Fish and Wildlife Department before setting out, reporting the poachers with detailed descriptions and coordinates. But justice for the dead wolf would take time, if it came at all. Right now, his priority was finding the rest of the pack before the hunters did. As he climbed higher into the mountains, following the increasingly difficult trail, Jack's thoughts turned to the conversation with his former colleague. He'd deliberately omitted any mention of the strange markings or their theory about wolf communication, focusing instead on the illegal hunting. Some things were too implausible to share without risking his credibility, and the protection of the wolves depended on that credibility. The trail led him to a steep ravine cut into the mountainside, its walls dropping sharply to a narrow stream bed 50 feet below. Jack moved cautiously along the edge, searching for signs of the pup's passage. The tracks disappeared entirely at a jumble of fallen rocks and exposed tree roots. Damn it, he muttered, scanning the area methodically. Had he lost the trail, or was this another deliberate attempt to obscure the path? A subtle movement caught his eye, not on the ground, but halfway down the ravine wall. There, on a narrow ledge partially concealed by an overhang, stood the wolf pup. It watched him intently, its amber eyes reflecting the same eerie intelligence he'd observed at the cabin. "Hey there," Jack said softly, crouching to appear less threatening. "Remember me?" The pup made no sound, but its ears flicked forward at his voice. It took a step along the ledge, then looked back at Jack in what seemed unmistakably like an invitation to follow. "You want me to come down there?" Jack asked incredulously. "That's at least a 40-foot descent on unstable ground." The pup repeated the motion, stepping forward, then looking back expectantly. "I must be losing my mind," Jack muttered, but began searching for a way down nonetheless. He found a possible route where tree roots and rock outcroppings created natural handholds down the ravine wall. Using his climbing experience, he descended carefully, testing each hold before committing his weight. When he reached the ledge, the pup had already disappeared into what Jack now saw was a narrow fissure in the rock face, a crevice just large enough for a man to squeeze through sideways. From within came a soft whining sound. Jack hesitated at the entrance, retrieving his flashlight and the handgun he carried for protection. "I hope I'm not making a fatal mistake here," he said aloud, then edged into the opening. The passageway widened after several feet, opening into a modest cave with a surprisingly high ceiling. What Jack saw inside stopped him cold. Lying on a bed of pine needles and dried grass were 4 adult wolves and 3 pups, including the one he'd followed. One adult had a visible wound on its hindquarters, the fur matted with dried blood. Another appeared unable to stand, its breathing labored. "Jesus," Jack whispered, taking in the scene. This was clearly part of the High Valley pack, driven to hiding by the hunters. The wolf with the wounded hindquarters raised its head weakly, eyes finding Jack's in the beam of his flashlight. There was no aggression in its posture, only exhaustion and something that looked disconcertingly like resignation. The pup that had led him here moved to the injured adult, likely another female from the pack, and nuzzled her gently before turning back to Jack with that same expectant gaze. Jack lowered his flashlight, mind racing. Wolves were typically extremely defensive around their dens, especially with injured pack members present. This behavior defied everything he knew about wolf ecology. And yet, "You brought me here for help," he said softly, the realization washing over him like a wave. "Somehow, you understood that we helped before, and you're asking again." He reached slowly for his pack, keeping his movements deliberate and smooth. "I'm not a veterinarian," he told the watching wolves, feeling only slightly ridiculous for speaking to them directly. "But I'll do what I can." Jack radioed Sarah, his voice tight with controlled excitement and disbelief. "Sarah, I found them. The pack, what's left of it. They're injured, hiding in a cave on the north face of Blacktail Ridge." Her voice crackled through the static. "Are you safe?" "Remarkably, yes," he replied, glancing at the wolves who continued to watch him with wary but non-threatening attention. "They're accepting my presence. I've never seen anything like it." "What do you need?" Sarah asked, her practical nature taking over. "The medical kit, the full one from your vet tech days. And bring that deer haunch from the freezer. These animals haven't eaten in days from the look of them." He paused, considering. "And Sarah? Bring Ethan." "Ethan?" The surprise was evident in her voice. "Jack, are you sure that's—" "Trust me," he interrupted. "There's something happening here that goes beyond normal wolf behavior. I think Ethan might be part of understanding it." As he ended the transmission, Jack settled on the cave floor, maintaining a respectful distance from the injured wolves. The pup that had led him here approached cautiously, sniffing at his outstretched hand before retreating to the wounded female. Outside, the sun was beginning its descent behind the mountains. Soon Sarah would arrive with supplies and their son. Jack knew that what they were witnessing could change scientific understanding of wolf cognition and interspecies communication forever. But first, they needed to keep these remarkable animals alive and safe from the hunters who still stalked the mountains. He looked into the amber eyes of the wounded wolf, seeing they're not just a wild animal, but a being with purpose and understanding. "Help is coming," he told her softly. "Just hold on." Dusk settled over the mountains by the time Sarah reached the ravine, Ethan secured in a child carrier on her back and a heavily laden pack containing medical supplies strapped across her chest. Jack had climbed back up to guide them down the treacherous slope, his face a mixture of urgency and barely contained wonder. "How are they?" Sarah asked immediately, helping Ethan out of the carrier. "Holding on," Jack replied, taking the supply pack. 2 adults with gunshot wounds, 1 critical. Another with what looks like a trap injury to the paw. The pups are unharmed physically, but they're dehydrated and hungry. Ethan tugged at his father's sleeve. "Can I see them now?" Jack knelt to his son's level. "Yes, but you need to be very quiet and very still. These wolves are scared and hurt. Even though they seem to trust us, they're still wild animals. Understand?" The boy nodded solemnly. "I'll be super quiet. Like when we watch deer." The descent to the cave entrance was painstaking, with Jack carrying Ethan through the most difficult sections. When they finally reached the narrow fissure, Jack went first, then helped Sarah and Ethan navigate the tight passage. Inside, the scene remained much as Jack had left it, except the wolves had arranged themselves slightly differently. The wounded adults in the center, surrounded protectively by the healthier members of the pack. The pup that had led Jack to the cave approached immediately, its attention fixed on Ethan. "Wolfie," Ethan whispered, a smile breaking across his face. "You're okay." Sarah set up a battery-powered lantern, casting the cave in a soft, warm light that revealed the full extent of the wolves' injuries. Her vet tech training took over as she assessed each animal clinically. "That one needs immediate attention," she said, nodding toward the female with the chest wound. "She's lost a lot of blood, and there's likely internal damage. Can you help her?" Jack asked. Sarah bit her lip. "Maybe, with proper facilities and a veterinarian, but here, I can clean the wound, give antibiotics, but beyond that." She shook her head. "We really should call in wildlife rescue and explain how we found a hidden wolf den by following a map drawn in snow." Jack challenged quietly. "Besides, by the time a rescue team gets here, those hunters might find this place. We have to help them now, and we have to move them to safety." "Move them where?" Sarah asked. "These animals need rest and medical care, not a forced march through the wilderness." "The Highland Nature Preserve," Jack suggested. "It's about 7 miles southwest. No hunting allowed, regularly patrolled by rangers. If we can get them there." Sarah's expression was skeptical. 7 miles? With wounded wolves?" "Jack, that's—" "Look," he interrupted, gesturing to the wolves. "They came to us. They trusted us enough to reveal their hiding place. We can't just—" He broke off as Ethan, who had been quietly watching the exchange, suddenly moved toward the injured female wolf. Both parents lunged forward, but froze in astonishment as the wolf made no aggressive move, instead lifting her muzzle slightly toward the approaching child. "Ethan," Sarah whispered tensely, "come back here slowly." But the boy continued forward until he stood directly before the wounded animal. With a gentleness that belied his 3 years, he placed his small hand on the wolf's head. "Don't be scared," he said softly. "My mom knows how to make you better." The wolf's eyes closed briefly at the touch, her posture relaxing visibly. Sarah and Jack exchanged looks of disbelief. "This is impossible," Jack murmured. "Apparently not," Sarah replied, her scientific mind struggling to categorize what she was witnessing. She took a deep breath, decision made. "Okay, I'll do what I can here, then we move them. But Jack, we need to be realistic. That female might not survive the journey. Better to try than leave them to be slaughtered," Jack said grimly. For the next hour, Sarah worked methodically, cleaning wounds, administering antibiotics, and bandaging injuries as best she could with their limited supplies. The wolves submitted to her ministrations with remarkable docility, especially when Ethan sat nearby, talking to them in a quiet, soothing voice. "The bullet passed clean through this one's shoulder," Sarah reported, finishing with the last adult. "No major vessels hit, from what I can tell. With antibiotics and rest, he should recover." "And the female?" Jack asked. Sarah's expression was grave. "The bullet's still in there. She needs surgery, Jack. I've done what I can to stabilize her, but—" Their conversation was interrupted by a sound that froze them all, the distant but unmistakable rumble of vehicle engines. Jack rushed to the cave entrance, listening intently. "Trucks," he confirmed, returning quickly, "coming up the north access road. It has to be those hunters. How could they have found this place?" Sarah asked, hurriedly packing her supplies. "They're tracking the wounded wolves," Jack explained grimly. "Probably followed blood trails to the ravine, same as I did with the pup's tracks." "What do we do?" Sarah asked, instinctively pulling Ethan closer. Jack checked his watch. It's almost full dark. That gives us some advantage. I know these mountains better than they do, and wolves can move at night better than humans. The injured ones can barely walk, let alone travel 7 miles, Sarah protested. We'll help them, Jack said, his mind racing through options. The adult males can move under their own power. You take Ethan and guide them. I'll carry the female in the travois we use for hauling deer. Sarah nodded, her face set with determination. And the pups? Our backpacks, Jack suggested. Empty the supplies. We can carry the pups that way. They worked quickly, fashioning a makeshift stretcher for the critically injured female from branches and Jack's coat. The other wounded wolves seemed to understand the urgency, struggling to their feet as Sarah and Jack prepared for departure. Most remarkably, the uninjured adult, a male with distinctive silver markings across his muzzle, began herding the pups toward Ethan, as if entrusting them to the boy. It's okay, Ethan told the wolf with that same unsettling certainty. We'll take care of them. Outside, the sound of engines grew louder, then stopped. The hunters had reached a point where vehicles could go no further and would continue on foot. We need to move, Jack urged, securing the travois to his shoulders. Stay off the main trails. Follow the creek bed where you can. It'll mask our scent and tracks. Sarah hoisted one pup into her emptied backpack, the small animal surprisingly cooperative, while Jack secured another in Ethan's smaller pack, adjusted to be carried in Sarah's arms. The third pup, stronger than its siblings, would travel alongside the adult males. Stay together, Jack instructed as they squeezed through the fissure into the gathering darkness. Use the moonlight, but stay under tree cover when possible. Head southwest. I'll catch up once I get the females secured for travel. Sarah hesitated, clearly reluctant to separate. Jack, I'll be right behind you, he promised. Those bastards aren't getting any more wolves today. As Sarah led Ethan and the stronger wolves into the night, Jack turned his attention to the injured female, securing her carefully on the improvised stretcher. Hang in there, he murmured, noting her labored breathing. Just a few more hours, and you'll be safe. Behind him, the sounds of men crashing through underbrush echoed across the ravine. The race to save the wolves had begun in earnest, with lives, both animal and potentially human, hanging in the balance. The story of the Montana wolves broke nationally 3 weeks after that harrowing night escape. The headline in the New York Times read, "Wolf Communication Breakthrough. Montana Family Documents Unprecedented Behavior." The accompanying photo showed Sarah, Jack, and Ethan Hartley standing beside Dr. Eleanor Whitman, the lead wildlife biologist from Montana State University who had been studying the wolves since their rescue. In the comfortable conference room of the Highland Nature Preserves Research Center, Jack sat across from a team of skeptical scientists, the evidence spread before them on the polished oak table. His detailed field notes, Sarah's medical records, photographs of the snow markings, and most compelling of all, high-definition video footage of the wolves' behavior around 3-year-old Ethan. I understand your hesitation, Jack said, addressing the panel. 3 months ago, I would have dismissed these claims myself. My entire career has been built on understanding wolf behavior through established scientific frameworks. But what we witnessed, what we documented, simply doesn't fit those frameworks. Dr. Whitman, a slender woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and piercing eyes, pointed to the time-stamped footage playing on the large monitor. This sequence here, the adult male deliberately arranging stones in a pattern matching your property layout, is particularly significant. We've run this by experts in primate cognition, and they're stunned. This demonstrates abstract symbolic thinking previously undocumented in canons. The youngest member of the scientific panel, a behavioral ecologist from Yale, leaned forward. The implications are staggering. If confirmed through peer review, this would represent not just an evolutionary leap in wolf cognition, but potentially rewrite our understanding of animal intelligence hierarchy. Sarah, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke. The communication wasn't just symbolic. There was intent behind it, a specific request for human intervention. They didn't just happen to create patterns we could interpret. They deliberately created patterns for us to interpret. Which brings us to the most controversial aspect, Dr. Whitman continued, advancing the presentation to footage of Ethan sitting cross-legged surrounded by wolf pups, the adults lying nearby in apparent relaxation. The child's unique connection with the pack. The room grew noticeably tenser. This was the element that had divided the scientific community since the preliminary findings were leaked to the media. The suggestion that a human child, particularly one as young as Ethan, could share some form of communication with wild wolves that adults could not. We're not claiming telepathy or anything supernatural, Jack clarified quickly, sensing the skepticism. But there's clearly something about Ethan's presence, perhaps his size, his scent, his body language, that the wolves respond to differently. Dr. Nathaniel Reeves, a respected neurobiologist who had flown in from Johns Hopkins specifically for this meeting, cleared his throat. We've analyzed the EEG readings from both Ethan and the juvenile wolf during their interaction sessions. The synchronization patterns in certain brainwave frequencies are, well, unprecedented in cross-species studies. Are you suggesting some form of neural synchrony? Asked the Yale ecologist, eyebrows raised. I'm suggesting we don't have adequate scientific language yet for what we're observing, Dr. Reeves replied carefully. The closest analog might be the emerging research on human-canine coevolution and the specialized neural pathways dogs have developed for reading human facial expressions and emotional states. But this goes several steps beyond that. On the monitor, footage showed the recovering female wolf, the one Jack had carried on the travois during their escape, approaching Ethan with what appeared to be deliberately placed stones in her mouth, depositing them in patterns at the boy's feet. We've documented 43 distinct patterns so far, Dr. Whitman explained. We believe they represent locations, warnings about territorial predators, food sources, and even rudimentary emotional concepts. Outside the conference room windows, the Highland Nature Preserve stretched in protected splendor. The wolves, now fully recovered from their injuries, occupied a specially designed habitat that allowed both freedom and ongoing research access. The poachers who had killed the mother wolf had been arrested and charged with multiple wildlife violations, their case serving as a flashpoint in the ongoing tension between conservation efforts and traditional hunting interests in Montana. The media coverage had been intense and polarizing. Conservative outlets questioned the scientific validity, suggesting the Hartleys had trained the wolves or fabricated evidence. Environmental groups hailed the discovery as vindication of their claims about animal intelligence and the moral imperative for stronger protection laws. Religious commentators debated the theological implications of non-human species displaying symbolic reasoning capabilities. For the Hartley family, the aftermath had been both wondrous and challenging. Their private life had been thrust into public scrutiny. Ethan, too young to fully comprehend his sudden fame, continued to visit his wolves daily, his interactions meticulously documented by researchers seeking to understand the mysterious connection. "Where do we go from here?" asked the foundation representative who was funding the research, speaking for the first time since the presentation began. Dr. Whitman exchanged glances with Jack and Sarah before answering. Phase 2 involves expanded cognitive testing, development of a more comprehensive symbolic lexicon, and controlled introduction of other children Ethan's age to determine if the connection is unique to him or potentially replicable. "And the broader implications?" pressed the representative. Jack answered this time, his voice thoughtful. "If we can establish that wolves, and potentially other species, possess the cognitive capacity for symbolic communication with humans, it fundamentally changes our relationship with the natural world. It's no longer a question of merely protecting species because they're ecologically important or inherently valuable. It becomes a matter of recognizing non-human intelligence and communication as worthy of moral consideration in itself." As the meeting concluded and the scientists filed out to observe the afternoon interaction session with the wolves, Sarah found herself standing alone with Jack by the windows, watching Ethan being prepared by researchers in the habitat below. "Did you ever imagine our decision that night, opening the shed door to a wolf in a snowstorm, would lead to all this?" she asked quietly. Jack shook his head, his expression a mixture of pride and lingering disbelief. "Science progresses one observation at a time. We just happened to be the ones who observed something extraordinary, and had the courage to report it, even knowing how it would sound," Sarah added, squeezing his hand. Below, as Ethan entered the habitat, the wolves approached him in formation, not as predators or even as wild animals tolerating human presence, but as beings engaged in communication with another intelligent species. The lead female, now fully recovered from her gunshot wound, carried something in her mouth that she placed carefully at the boy's feet. A small arrangement of colored stones in a pattern the researchers had come to recognize as the symbol for family. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Hartleys' property as Sarah stood on the cabin porch, a steaming mug of coffee warming her hands against the autumn chill. 8 months had passed since the night they'd rescued the wolf pack. 8 months of scientific breakthrough, media scrutiny, and profound change for their family. She watched as Ethan, now nearly 4, played in the yard with Buck, their border collie. The dog had adapted remarkably well to their occasional lupin visitors, seeming to understand his role as intermediary between the domestic and wild worlds that now overlapped in their lives. Package arrived from Dr. Whitman. Jack called, emerging from their newly constructed home office with a padded envelope. The research grant from the National Science Foundation had allowed them to expand the cabin, adding dedicated space for their ongoing documentation work. Sarah smiled. The advance copy of her paper for Nature, and the photos from last week's cognitive trials, Jack confirmed, joining her on the porch. Looks like they're officially naming the communication system Canis symbolic cognition in the literature. Rather clinical term for something so magical, Sarah mused, taking the envelope. Jack chuckled. Science needs its terminology. Better than wolf riding or paw semaphore, which is what some of the popular press has been calling it. The scientific community had moved from skepticism to cautious acceptance as the evidence became impossible to dismiss. 3 independent research teams had now confirmed the Hartleys' observations, documenting similar symbolic communication behaviors in 2 other wolf packs that had been exposed to the original group through controlled interactions at the Highland Preserve. Most remarkable was how the ability seemed to spread through wolf populations, not through genetic inheritance, but through social learning, suggesting a cognitive flexibility previously unrecognized in canids. The working theory was that the capacity had always existed as latent potential, activated only through the unique circumstances of human-wolf cooperation that had occurred at the Hartley cabin. "Mom, Dad, look," Ethan called excitedly, pointing toward the forest edge. There, standing in the golden light of the setting sun, was a familiar figure, the young wolf who had once been an injured pup seeking shelter in their tool shed. Now fully grown into a magnificent adult, she stood with the confident posture of a pack leader. Wildlife tracking collars identified her as F237, but to the Hartleys, she would always be simply Scout, the name Ethan had given her. "She's back," Sarah whispered, setting down her coffee mug. Jack checked the property boundaries with practiced eyes. Alone this time. No sign of the others. Scout remained at the forest edge, watching the cabin with those intelligent amber eyes. She made no move to approach closer, respecting the boundary that had been established through months of careful interaction protocols developed by the research team. Ethan looked up at his parents questioningly. "Can I go say hi?" "Standard protocol," Jack reminded him gently. "We observe first. If she initiates communication, then we respond." The family watched as Scout lowered her head to the ground, using her paw to scrape at the earth deliberately. After several careful movements, she stepped back, looking toward them expectantly. "She's left a message," Sarah said, reaching for the binoculars they now kept permanently by the door. Through the magnified view, she could make out the now familiar pattern, concentric circles with a line pointing toward the distant mountains, the symbol they had documented as representing journey or returning. "I think this is goodbye," Jack said quietly after studying the marking himself. The tracking data from last week showed her pack moving northward, following the elk migration. This might be her letting Ethan know they're leaving the area. Sarah felt an unexpected tightness in her throat. Despite all the scientific documentation, all the papers and research protocols, the bond that had formed between this wild creature and their son remained profoundly moving. "Can I go now?" Ethan asked again, his small face solemn with understanding beyond his years. Jack nodded. "Just to the halfway point. Remember the rules." They watched as Ethan walked carefully to the designated interaction area, a flat clearing midway between the cabin and the forest edge that had been established as a safe communication zone. Scout observed his approach, her posture alert but relaxed. When Ethan reached the clearing, he knelt and used a stick to draw in the dirt, a circle with a smaller circle inside it, the symbol they had documented as representing family or pack? Scout watched intently, then responded by adding her own mark, extending Ethan's symbol with a curved line that Dr. Whitman's team interpreted as suggesting connection across distance. She's telling him they'll come back, Sarah interpreted, her voice soft with emotion. Or that distance doesn't sever bonds, Jack added. Either way, it's remarkable. As the sunset painted the Montana landscape in hues of amber and gold, Ethan and Scout sat facing each other across a small distance of Earth, representatives of species separated by millennia of evolution, yet connected by something that transcended biological categories. After several minutes of this quiet communion, Scout rose and turned toward the forest. At the edge of the trees, she paused, looking back one final time. Then, lifting her head toward the darkening sky, she released a single, haunting howl that echoed across the valley. Deep, resonant, and carrying a complexity of tone that seemed to contain both farewell and promise. Ethan stood, his small figure silhouetted against the sunset, and raised his hand in a wave. "See you next year," he called confidently. As Scout disappeared into the gathering dusk, Jack placed an arm around Sarah's shoulders. "You know, when I studied wildlife management, they taught us that the history of wolves and humans was primarily one of conflict, that we were natural adversaries competing for resources and territory." Sarah leaned into his embrace. "And now I think maybe we've been missing something all along," he replied thoughtfully. "Not just about wolves, but about our place in the natural world. Maybe these boundaries we've created between human and animal intelligence aren't as fixed as we thought." Inside the cabin, the secure computer that connected them to research teams across the country pinged with new data. The GPS coordinates from Scout's collar tracking her journey back to her pack, her movements being analyzed by scientists still struggling to fully comprehend the implications of what the Hartleys had discovered. But here, in this moment as darkness settled over the Montana wilderness, scientific analysis seemed secondary to the simple truth before them. That connection could form across the seemingly unbridgeable divide between species, that understanding could transcend the limitations of language, and that compassion, shown on a snowy night to a creature in need, could lead to discoveries that changed how humanity viewed its relationship with the natural world. As they turned to go inside, Ethan's voice carried on the evening air, asking the question that researchers and philosophers would likely debate for generations to come. "Mom, do you think other animals are trying to talk to us too? Maybe we just haven't learned how to listen yet." Sarah met Jack's gaze over their son's head, seeing in his eyes the same wonder that had first brought them to this remote mountain homestead, the belief that there were still mysteries to discover in the world around them. "Maybe, sweetheart," she replied, as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. "Maybe we're just beginning to learn how to listen." English, US, translation. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and if you've watched this far, comment, "I watched this far," and leave your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears in the end screen. It's very exciting.